This is a presentation of the gross features of the supraspinal regions of the central nervous system. Note, the buttons throughout the show have been disabled in this YouTube video. The study will include examination of surface features of the cerebral hemispheres, the ventricles of the brain, surface features of the brainstem, as well as the cranial nerves that arise from the brainstem, and the arterial supply of the brain. The surface of the telencephalon consists of a highly convoluted surface of gray matter, the cerebral cortex, forming ridges or gyri, which are separated by grooves or sulci. Some of these sulci subdivide the cerebral hemisphere into lobes. The central sulcus, the lateral sulcus, and the parietal occipital sulcus, of which we only see a little notch there, but is more visible on the medial surface. Anterior to the central sulcus and above the lateral sulcus, we have the frontal lobe. And posterior to the central sulcus and anterior to the parietal occipital sulcus, we have the parietal lobe. And posterior to the parietal occipital sulcus, we have the occipital lobe. Below the lateral sulcus is the temporal lobe. The surface of the cerebral hemisphere can be further subdivided by a number of other sulci, which we'll just view as I click through the numbers here. As a result of having these additional sulci, with the surface of the cerebral hemisphere is further subdivided into a number of gyri. So we have a superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, inferior frontal gyrus, in which there is a primary language center contained within that region, the precentral gyrus, which contains neurons for the primary motor cortex and for voluntary control of our muscles. Postcentral gyrus, which has the primary somatosensory cortex for fine touch and pain and texture sensibility. The supramarginal gyrus, angular gyrus, superior temporal gyrus, which includes some of our auditory centers and another language center in this area, and the middle temporal gyrus. Looking at the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere, we're going to highlight some of the sulci and gyri. So we have a cingulate sulcus, a precentral sulcus, and the central sulcus, parietal occipital, and calcarine sulci. The following gyri: cingulate gyrus, and paracentral lobule, which represents the medial extension of the primary motor and somatosensory cortices, and the lower limb portion of the body is essentially represented on this surface. The cuneus and the lingual gyrus. It's this region of the occipital lobe adjacent to the calcarine fissure where the primary visual cortex is represented. This section will examine the ventricular system of the brain. There are 4 ventricles, 2 lateral, sometimes called ventricles 1 and 2, 3rd ventricle, and 4th ventricle. Each ventricle has specialized tissue that produces the cerebrospinal fluid that circulates through the ventricular system and then eventually exits to flow into the subarachnoid space and surround the whole central nervous system with cerebrospinal fluid. We'll start out our study of the ventricular system with the lateral ventricles. Lateral ventricles are found one in each hemisphere. It's a C-shaped structure consisting of a body, an anterior horn, posterior horn, and inferior horn. In this specimen, we can see a spongy-like material contained in the ventricle, and that is the choroid plexus, the source of cerebrospinal fluid in the lateral ventricle. Here's a view of the lateral ventricles from above after removing a portion of the cerebral hemisphere. Note that the two ventricles are separated by a membranous band of tissue known as the septum pellucidum, and in the floor of the lateral ventricles we have the choroid plexus. The cerebrospinal fluid that is produced here flows through the interventricular foramen to enter the third ventricle. The third ventricle is found within the diencephalon, at the level of the diencephalon, and it has its choroid plexus located in the roof. But it also is receiving the cerebrospinal fluid from the lateral ventricle by way of the interventricular foramen. In this half-brain specimen, we see an excellent example of the major commissural bundle that connects the two cerebral hemispheres, and that's the corpus callosum, which has a body, a splenium posteriorly, and a genu anteriorly. Also, we can see the membrane that separates the two lateral ventricles, the septum pellucidum. Now, focusing on the third ventricle, we see outlined now in the lateral wall there are two diencephalic nuclear areas represented, the thalamus and the hypothalamus, which are separated by a shallow groove known as the hypothalamic sulcus. The following are three borders of the third ventricle that are going to be outlined. Some of the structures mentioned will be discussed in other slideshows. We have the column of the fornix anteriorly, anterior commissure, and the lamina terminalis. Posteriorly, we have the pineal body, posterior commissure, and the cerebral aqueduct, which communicates cerebrospinal fluid from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. And inferiorly, there are three structures that are related to the diencephalon: the optic chiasm, which is the point where the two optic nerves come together; the infundibular stalk, which sends fiber projections to the pituitary gland; and then the mammillary body. These are all inferiorly positioned. So in this half-brain specimen, we can again see the third ventricle. It communicates, and any fluid, cerebrospinal fluid produced by the lateral and third ventricle is going to flow to the fourth ventricle by way of the cerebral aqueduct. All the cerebrospinal fluid produced in the ventricular system flows into the subarachnoid space from the fourth ventricle by way of three openings: a midline opening or foramen known as a foramen of Magendie, and two lateral openings which we can't see here. Here's our foramen of Magendie just between the medulla and the cerebellum. In this posterior view of the brainstem with this part of the cerebellum removed, we can see the rhomboid-shaped fourth ventricle. The fourth ventricle communicates with the subarachnoid space by way of three openings or foramina: the midline foramen of Magendie indicated here, and also two lateral ones, the foramina of Luschka, which are shown as they project laterally. In this ventriculographic image, we can see all the components of the ventricular system of the brain, starting with the lateral ventricle, having its three horns, anterior, posterior, and inferior horn, and then the third ventricle, which is connected with the lateral ventricle by way of the interventricular foramen, and then the fourth ventricle, which receives cerebrospinal fluid from the third and lateral ventricles by way of the cerebral aqueduct. Eventually, of course, all the cerebrospinal fluid flows into the subarachnoid space from the fourth ventricle by way of the three openings, the foramen magendi and two lateral foramina vrushka. This section is looking at examining the ventral and dorsal aspects of the brainstem. We'll start off with the midbrain. The midbrain has two prominent or robust bundles of fibers on the surface, and they are the crus cerebri. And it has some diencephalic structures which are visible here and have a relationship to the midbrain. They are the optic tracts, which are here seen as embracing the crus cerebri, and two other components of the visual pathway are the optic nerve and optic chiasm. The chiasm is the point of where the two optic nerves come together. And one last thing that's part of the diencephalon here and is adjacent to the midbrain is the mammillary bodies. As we move on to the pons, we see that this barrel-chested ventral surface of the pons tapers off laterally into fiber bundles that project to the cerebellum, and that's the middle cerebellar peduncle. On the medulla, we have a couple elevations that we can see here. The pyramid, this elongated elevation, is due to an underlying bundle of fibers known as the corticospinal tract, and then the olive is due to an underlying nucleus, the inferior olivary nucleus. The anterior median fissure, as we follow that down, it deviates off to one side slightly, and that's usually an indication where we have a large group of nerve fibers of the corticospinal tract that decussate. And this is known as the pyramidal decussation at that point. Now, as we examine the dorsal surface of the brainstem, we see the fourth ventricle and its three openings that lead to the subarachnoid space, the singular foramen magendi, and there's a pair of foramina vrushka. At the midbrain level, there are two pair of elevations that are due to nuclei of the same name, and they are the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. A diencephalic structure that is just above those paired elevations is the pineal body. Down on medullary levels, there are three elevations to be noted. The gracilis tubercle, cuneate tubercle, part of the somatosensory pathway of the nervous system, and the tuberculum cinerum, which is part of the trigeminal system. Then we have some fiber bundles that lead from each brainstem level to the cerebellum and carry information to or from the cerebellum. And this is the, first we see the superior cerebellar peduncle, then we have a middle cerebellar peduncle, and then the inferior cerebellar peduncle. This section examines the cranial nerves. The first two cranial nerves, as I've mentioned previously in other shows, are really fiber tract extensions of the telencephalon and diencephalon respectively, and they are the olfactory, which we can't see on this specimen, and the optic, which is part of the diencephalon. The oculomotor nerve is a branch of the midbrain, as well as the trochlear nerve is also, but we can't really see it very well from this approach. Coming off the pons, we have four cranial nerves that are related to that. First is the trigeminal, cranial nerve 5. Then abducens, number 6. Facial, number 7. And 8, the vestibulocochlear. Down in the medullary level, we have a cluster of nerves coming off, and they are collectively the glossopharyngeal, vagus, and accessory. There's probably not a true cranial accessory nerve. It's most likely part of the vagus nerve. The spinal accessory arising from the spinal cord cannot be visualized in this because it is probably still back in the cranial cavity. The 12th cranial nerve arises and emerges between the two elevations, the pyramid and the olive. We have fragments of those that are maybe visualized here. Viewing the dorsal surface of the brainstem and emerging from the midbrain, we can see the only cranial nerve that does exit the dorsal surface and ultimately does sweep around to the ventral surface. That is the trochlear nerve, the 4th cranial nerve. Here we see it just exiting just below the inferior colliculus. The arterial supply to the brain comes by way of 2 sets of paired arteries, the vertebral arteries and the internal carotid arteries. The vertebral arteries give rise to a posterior inferior cerebellar artery. As the name implies, it helps supply the cerebellum. And then it joins, the 2 vertebrals join to form the basilar artery. And the basilar artery gives rise to 2 arteries, the anterior inferior cerebellar and the superior cerebellar arteries. As you see, sometimes the superior cerebellar arteries are doubled. The basilar artery then divides into 2 posterior cerebral arteries, which give rise to or give off posterior communicating artery that combines or joins with the internal carotid. The internal carotid artery then gives rise to the anterior cerebral artery, and at that point will then continue on as the middle cerebral artery. Some of these arteries have a close relationship with cranial nerves, and here's 2 cranial nerves that are related to the arteries. This is important in the event that these arteries develop an aneurysm. As the aneurysm gets larger, it could affect the function of these nerves. And so we see the oculomotor nerve here located between the posterior cerebral and superior cerebellar artery. And then the trigeminal nerve has a close relationship with the superior cerebellar artery. Also on this slide, we see a collection of nerves that are branches of the pontine level, and they are the facial and the vestibulocochlear cranial nerves, and situated between the 2 is a nervus intermedius, which is a subpart of the facial nerve. So here we have a second look at the arterial supply of the brain. We have a pair of vertebral arteries and a pair of internal carotid arteries, being the 4 being the primary blood supply to the brain. The vertebral arteries are here we see that giving off the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and in this case also we see the anterior spinal arteries coming off the vertebral. The vertebrals join to form the basilar artery. Basilar artery is giving rise to the anterior inferior cerebellar and also the superior cerebellar. The basilar artery is then dividing into the posterior cerebral arteries, and it gives off a posterior communicating branch that links up with the internal carotid artery. Then the internal carotid artery continues on and gives rise to the anterior cerebral artery. And the 2 anterior cerebral arteries are joined by an anterior communicating artery. The internal carotid artery terminates as the middle cerebral artery. As before, we see some cranial nerves having relationships with some of these arteries, and that can be impacted if there's an aneurysm of these arteries. So we see the internal carotid artery has a close relationship with the optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract region. The oculomotor nerve lies between posterior cerebral and superior cerebellar artery. And the trigeminal nerve, especially on the one side, has a very close relationship with the anterior and inferior cerebellar artery. In fact, this artery has been implicated in a condition that develops with regard to trigeminal nerve. It's called trigeminal neuralgia. This slide is going to be focusing on one particular area, and that's the arterial circle of Willis. This arterial circle of Willis consists of the basilar artery, posterior cerebral arteries, posterior communicating arteries, internal carotid arteries, anterior cerebral artery, and the anterior communicating. As you can see, this creates an anastomotic ring of arterial channels that supply the brain, and is very important, especially if there were a blockage of one of the major vessels supplying the brain. The other vessels would make up for that, and this anastomotic ring would make up for that blockage and not result in the loss of blood supply to that particular part of the brain. So looking at the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere, this is the left cerebral hemisphere, we're going to see the distribution of the cerebral arteries on this surface. As you see, the middle cerebral artery supplies most of this lateral surface and includes a large portion of the voluntary motor cortex and somatosensory cortex. Also in the left hemisphere, we have usually in most individuals the language centers, and this middle cerebral artery does supply those language centers on this surface. The auditory cortex is also within this confined area of the middle cerebral artery. The anterior cerebral artery is shown here as it supplies the more medial region of this lateral surface. That would include lower limb areas for voluntary control of muscles of the lower limb and somatosensory aspects of the lower limb. The posterior cerebral artery supplies almost all, if not all, of the occipital lobe, and that's a center for the visual cortex. The medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere is supplied by two of the cerebral arteries, the anterior cerebral supplying the largest volume of tissue. It does include the voluntary motor cortex and somatosensory cortex for the lower limb on the surface. And the posterior cerebral artery, as noted before, supplies basically all of the occipital lobe. The primary visual cortex lies within that calcarine fissure on the surface and is supplied by the posterior cerebral artery. And here is the index of slides we saw on this show for your reference.